Okay, going to do a quick introduction to Egypt. Here we go. Um, there are four basic periods that we'll talk about with respect to Egypt. There's the pre-dynastic period, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Now, in truth, there are more periods in Egyptian history than just these, but these are the ones that we're going to be concerned with. And in fact, we don't actually even have any works from the Middle Kingdom. We only have works from the pre-dynastic Old Kingdom and New Kingdom. This is not necessarily a surprise because one of the things you definitely need to remember um, with respect to Egyptian art is that it doesn't really change. It goes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years not changing. And this is notable. There are reasons for the not changing, mostly having to do with the function of most artwork, or much artwork in Egyptian culture, not every single bit, but what we look at. So if you look at something from pre-dynastic Egypt, it's going to look very, very similar to something that comes from the New Kingdom, even though they are hundreds of years apart. I want you to think about the change of art, generally in the West, and we're talking about ancient Mediterranean Egyptian work. It's not technically the West, but it's very influential on what goes on, certainly in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, but also in Greece. Typically, when we think about Western art, we think about art that evolves and changes over time, but that's not what we have here. The one exception is in the New Kingdom. There's a brief, very, very brief, only lasts the tenure of one particular pharaoh. It's called the Amarna period, and everything changes during the Amarna period, and then it goes back because the priests didn't like what happened with the changes there. I'll get into that in a bit. So we have our enduring understandings here. Most Egyptian art, at least that we look at, focuses on representing royal figures and divine figures. And of course, royal figures like the pharaoh, of course, are divine because they're understood to be, just children of the sun god, so they are divine. They're not just kings. But also, we have the depiction of actual gods, which are anthropomorphic or in animal shape. The Egyptians were also interested in funerary and palatial complexes. You heard me mentioned earlier that Egyptian art doesn't change very much, and the reason why it doesn't change very much is that much of it is focused on death and the afterlife. And because it's focused on death and the afterlife, it has to it emphasizes a kind of permanence, and the rules don't change in terms of how art is produced very much in the hundreds of years. As I mentioned earlier, we can see through Egyptian artwork that they were influential and had contact with ancient Near Eastern cultures as well as Greece. Their influence on Greece is undeniable. However, when we get to Greece, you'll see what the Greeks do in terms of changing and revolutionizing, particularly the depiction of the human body. But we'll get to that later. Next, you see the one piece that is the change. I mentioned the one period, a little kind of mini period within the New Kingdom called the Amarna period. And this is our one piece from the Amarna period. This is Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and three daughters. And if you've seen a lot of Egyptian art, maybe you have, maybe you haven't. If you've seen a lot of Egyptian art, you'll notice that it really does depict the human body very differently. They do follow some conventions still, traditional conventions, but we see kind of a not idealized royal form, and we're used to seeing very idealized royal forms. We see a very domestic, casual scene here. That's not something we would normally see. And we see a god, Aten, which is not anthropomorphized. We're used to seeing anthropomorphized gods or god animal combos. Usually is what we see with Egyptian art, but we'd have something that's not in that kind of figural form at all. This is a result of a change in religion. Akhenaten totally changes the religion away from Ra and to Aten. And with the change in religion, there was a massive change in culture, very briefly, and also a change in artistic styles. Okay. I mentioned earlier, we want to look at the artistic innovations that we see in Egypt, as well as the conventions that we see in Egypt. The Egyptians were very well known for a particular canon. And you've heard me say canon before in relation to Polykleitos' spear bearer. But again, remember, all canon means is rule. Or law. The Egyptians had very, very strict canon proportions, rules about how the human body is portrayed. And so we always want to look to and compare the way the Egyptians depict the human body and how the cultures of the ancient Near East and Greece do as well. I've mentioned that already. Moving on, we'll see a lot of depictions in which human figures interact with gods. Now, I mentioned most of the artwork that we'll look at depicts royal figures. We do have a few non-royal figures, but they are all high-ranking non-royal figures. We don't get paintings of peasants and people working the field in the Egyptian art that we're looking at. So in this particular one, which is a scroll from the Book of the Dead, the Last Judgment of Hunnefer, this guy Hunnefer is going into the underworld, and his heart is going to be weighed to see if he deserves this kind of eternal life in the afterlife or not. So we see him interacting with gods. We see also here the Palette of King Narmer. This is our pre-dynastic piece. And Narmer is our guy. He's known for uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. And he's historically significant because of that. And we see him, this is Horus, the god Horus here. And so he's kind of interacting with this god Horus. So we see human and god interaction. I don't think that Narmer was considered divine because this is before he wasn't a pharaoh, he was a king. Another thing that we need to think about with respect to form in Egyptian art is what we call registers. So a register is a horizontal organization of a particular part of the story. So in this piece of Hunnefer, I've got a register here. And I've also got another register up here. So we have a 2-register piece. This is also a work that we identify as continuous narration. We see Narmer appears more than once in this story. And so does Anubis here. And he's also up here, but we'll get into continuous narration later. If we look down at the Palette of King Narmer, we see it's 2-sided, obviously. I say 1, 2, 3, 4 registers on one side and 1, 2, 3 registers on the other. So again, these registers are these horizontal sections that organize the story. There's also a significant emphasis on historical narratives, which is what we get with the Palette of Narmer, because it is depicting or documenting the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. This up here is not a historical record. It's a Book of the Dead. It's how you get to the afterlife and through the afterlife successfully. So if we look at the next one, we see that the art of dynamic Egypt embodies a sense of permanence, right? Because remember, much of this artwork was created for the afterlife, for eternity, and so it has to last. And so there is a suggestion of a heavy permanence with that. So we mentioned that with respect to the materials used in Narmer, King Narmer and Queen, that really hard gray whack, which is just going to last. We see that also in Tutankhamun's innermost coffin with the gold. This particular coffin was ensconced in another coffin, ensconced in another coffin. So there are layers and layers here. It's all about protecting the pieces so that the cycle of death and rebirth is protected. Because these artworks are not just memorial artworks. They're not memorial artworks at all. They are meant to house the body here of Tutankhamun. And here, of course, is the Ka statue where the soul goes if something were to happen to the mummy. So I mentioned the kind of focus on death. There's an elaborate funerary sect, so many rituals, so much focused on on death and the preparation for death and the preparation for the afterlife. You know what Ka statues are. You know that Menkara and Queen is Ka statue. So is this. This is also a Ka statue. And you notice that they're very different, and I'll talk about why that is in just a few moments. There's a lot of mythological and religious symbolism. We saw that certainly with the Tutankhamun's innermost coffin. We have all these signs of both gods as well as the signs of the pharaoh. There's also in Egyptian art emphasis on really monumental stone architecture, big, gigantic stone architecture. We see that in the Temple of Amun-Ra, as well as the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. And all these big, gigantic structures that were built emphasize who? The power of the pharaoh, the power of the pharaoh. And that's going to be really important. And because the pharaoh, remember, is a direct descendant of the sun god. So it's not just a really powerful or important king. He is a god, right? So architecturally, one of the innovations that we need to make note of is what's called a clerestory. We'll talk about clerestory windows when we get to the Temple of Amun-Ra. Keep your ear out for that. It has to do with how much light gets let into the building. I mentioned that this is a Ka statue, and so, of course, is Menkara and Queen. But we notice if we look at it, they're very, very different. This statue, which is a Ka statue called the Seated Scribe, is made with entirely different material. It's made of limestone. Limestone is a much softer stone than gray whack, and so it's not going to last as long. But before you think that means that this guy is just some lowly dude, he is not. Only high-ranking people even have Ka statues. And this guy is a scribe, which means that he is a high-ranking person. But not as high ranking, of course, as the pharaoh, so the material is different. And also the way the human body is depicted. We see that this guy's kind of a middle-aged guy, and he's got some flab, and he's kind of got big ears, and he's depicted far more naturalistically than the more idealized Menkara and Queen, and that is because the rules for depicting royalty and deities are different than the rules for depicting non-royals. But again, that has to do with the canon, their canon, and how they treat people of differing ranks. So that is all I have to say. I just want to mention what the works are. So here's Palette of King Narmer, right, with the registers, 1, 2, 3, 4 registers here, 1, 2, 3 registers there. That is our one pre-dynastic piece. It is also made of gray whack, which is going to be significant. We'll think about why that is. The Seated Scribe we haven't gotten to. He's very interesting. I like him a lot. The Ka statue, but very different from our other Ka statue of Menkara and Queen. Then we also have the Great Pyramids, and you'll notice that it's Menkara. Oh my gosh, it's spelled slightly differently, I think. I think we were looking at it with an E at the end, but it's the same guy. That's his pyramid. It's the smallest. It's also the youngest. And then we have Khafre and Khufu. But of course, all of these pyramids were set up for helping out the pharaoh in the afterlife and ensuring that he has everything that he needs. And we'll get to that later, but that's some of that monumental stone architecture. Of course, we know this piece already. Then we have the Temple of Amun-Ra, right? I say Ra, but it's pronounced, you can also say Re, but everybody says Amun-Ra. We'll talk about the structure of the temple and how it becomes progressively more exclusive the further you walk into it. So that's a really important part. Also listen for the clerestory and the clerestory windows, and also pylons when we get to this one. Those just the kind of layout of the temple as it originally was. There also is going to be something that you'll also want to listen for called a hypostyle hall. A hypostyle hall is a big, gigantic deal. Then we have the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. If you know anything about Hatshepsut, you'll know she's a female pharaoh, and she's very controversial. And one of the things that she does before she dies is she, has her mortuary temple designed so that it is actually carved into the rock cliff, right? So you can't really get rid of it, I guess, unless you had explosives, which they don't at this point. And so that's a very clear choice on her part. And we'll talk more about her mortuary temple. She's not actually buried in a mortuary temple. No one's actually buried in a mortuary temple. It's just where you go to make offerings to the deceased. Because remember, the deceased pharaohs are gods. Even Hatshepsut, who depicts herself very masculinely, or has herself depicted very masculinely in this image. So then here's the one exception, the Akhenaten Nefertiti and three daughters, that Amarna period, which is that blip in Egyptian artistic styles where we've got a very different way of depicting the human body and a very different general depiction of royals. We see them in that domestic scene, which we would not have seen before. And then Tutankhamun's tomb, the innermost coffin, all that gold, just shockingly lavish in the expense there. And then the Book of the Dead, but Hunefer. So the registers that I mentioned. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that gives you a good, solid introduction about where we're going to be going with Egypt